Welcome to the 70th episode of Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name's Michael Dwan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London, and today I want to talk about queer theory and queering. I also want to introduce the idea of generative ethics. What do proponents of queer theory believe, and what do they want when they go about queering things? I'll suggest that there's a baby in that bathwater, but there's quite a lot of bathwater. I want to be clear at the outset that there are many different opinions on what is meant by queer. People who identify as queer or who pledge allegiance to that flag often can't define what it means. What I'm going to say won't be true for all of them. I will be focusing on what is said in academic literature about it, what the authorities on queer say. And even they don't agree on every point. So I'll be generalizing the main tenets of queer theory. I will tell you what I think is wrong with it and why it is regressive and destructive, but I will also try to preserve what is true and useful about it. First, a little history. Some of the big names in queer theory are Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, Eve Kosofsky, Sedgwick, Lee Edelman, Jack Halberstam, and David Halperin. As most of us know or can remember, once the term queer was a slur against homosexuality. Then in the 80s and 90s, the LGBTQ plus community began to reclaim the word as a positive self-description and challenge hetero and cis normativity. Then in the 90s, the idea of queer and queering expanded beyond challenging sexual and gender norms and increasingly included almost all other social norms. This quote from David Halperin's 1995 book, Saint Foucault, I think captures where it all has gone. And I quote, "Queer identity need not be grounded in any positive truth or in any stable reality. It is an identity without an essence. Queer, then, demarcates not a positivity, but a positionality vis-a-vis the normative. A personality that is not restricted to lesbians and gay men, but is in fact available to anyone who is or feels marginalized because of her or his sexual practices. Queer is, by definition, whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant." Unquote. With a definition like this, it's not surprising that many who claim to be queer cannot state in positive terms what it means. This definition by Halperin helped to solidify a growing tendency to expand queer beyond sexuality and gender, particularly the last sentence, which defined it as a general positionality of being at odds with the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant. If you weren't sure about the difference between queer theory and queering, it's this. Queer theory is the body of ideas about the oppressive nature of social norms. In that sense, it's a noun. Queering, on the other hand, is a verb. It's the active subversion of norms and the power structures that they presumably uphold. It is also a reimagining and enacting whatever represents a subversion of the norms it wants to disrupt. Here are just a few of the other social areas beyond sexuality and gender that it has been queering or at odds with. Fashion, family structure, art and media, language and rhetoric, education and knowledge, spaces and places, technology and digital spaces, time and chronology, religion and spirituality, and body and health, to name just a few. The essence of queering is to question, subvert, and destabilize norms, binaries, and fixed categories in all of these areas, and more, many more. It didn't take long to recite this limited list, but think about it for a moment. What if there was significant subversion and destabilization of norms in all of these areas? This is the general aim of queering that I will now critique. I recently did a video exploring the topic of authenticity. If you haven't seen it, you'll recognize that I'll be approaching queering in a similar way. I see queering mostly as an immature version of authenticity, but instead of simply expressing one's true self, It seeks to deconstruct and destroy all social norms that might put constraints on that expression. It wants to change the world to allow for maximal individual freedom. I'll be taking a developmental view and suggesting that much, if not most, of what I see calling itself queering is a regression to or being stuck at an early narcissistic stage of development. Harvard developmental psychologist Robert Kegan calls this stage the instrumental or imperial stage. For the purposes of my argument, it will be helpful if I very briefly describe 3 key developmental stages that Kegan has identified, starting with the imperial stage. Stick with me, it won't take long. At the imperial stage, we're identified with our desires and our goals, and we see relationships as instrumental. In other words, we value our relationships only to the extent that they help us get what we want or get in the way of what we want. The next stage, Kegan calls the interpersonal stage. Here we can take other people's perspectives and have some capacity for empathy. We identify ourselves relationally in terms of our social roles. Because we now value others and our relationships with them in themselves, we adopt social norms and conventions. We still have individual desires and goals, but these are subordinated to our social connections and belongingness. Beyond the interpersonal stage, Kegan describes what he calls the self-authoring stage. At this stage, we can question social norms and conventions, and we can fashion our own point of view. This view is based on primary values and principles that we have learned and experienced. But now we can consciously choose to adhere to them. In other words, we are the author of who we are and no longer simply identify with what is socially expected. Here we realize that social norms are just one way to live in accordance with first principles, and that there are other valid ways. Each of these 3 stages are important in our development, and each successive stage builds on the previous stages and expands our sense of self. I'll come back to this important point later. I explain Kegan's model in greater detail in my video on authenticity and include an additional stage. If you're interested, you can check it out. I'll leave a link at the end, but I will leave it at this for my exploration of queering. Queering has the potential for being expressed at the self-authoring stage, but that is not what I see it doing most of the time. That would require that it not be indiscriminately antagonistic to social norms. Based on these 3 developmental stages described by Kegan, here is the essence of my critique of queering. It goes like this. It's necessary and good that we know and pursue our desires and goals. That's the imperial stage. It is also necessary and good that human beings in all cultures and societies have social norms and agreements that establish social cohesion and collaboration. As a social species, we cannot survive otherwise. This is not an optional social construct. While there is great cultural diversity in how we go about this, we must go about it somehow. That's the interpersonal stage. And while our social norms are good and necessary, they can also become rigid and oppressive. To address this, we need to routinely examine them and periodically revise and update our social norms and agreements. That's the self-authoring stage. The problem is that queering elevates the freedom of the individual to the pinnacle of importance. It glorifies the imperial stage. It seeks to transform the social world into a place where individual expression is paramount, protected, and accommodated. It does this by being at odds with whatever is normal, legitimate, and dominant. It does not recognize the positive function of constraints on individual freedoms in service to social cohesion and collaboration. If you think it does, show me where any queer theorist ever said so. It assumes that all constraints are unjustly oppressive. This is the position of a toddler in the throes of a temper tantrum, essentially narcissistic. If you're liking this video so far, give it a like. And if you aren't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so you can see my future videos when I post them. As well, let me know what you think in the comments. I try to respond to every comment. All right, let's get back to our topic. A particular element of social norms that queering is at odds with is boundaries. At the imperial stage, mostly where I believe queering resides, if a boundary constrains individual identity or self-expression or is an obstacle to one's desires, then it should be dissolved or made more flexible. Apart from the general tendency of queering to destabilize the social fabric, critics are also concerned about how queering in education causes children to be confused about gender and prematurely set off on a path of transitioning. There is a concern about indoctrination into what is seen as a cult. As well, there's concern that the deconstruction of age boundaries can make children vulnerable to exploitation. Another bugaboo for queer theory is hierarchies. Anything placed above anything else screams tyranny for the queer. This view is largely informed by postmodern theory. Anything that imposes order is by definition oppressive. This would include developmental models like Kegan's. Queer challenges the idea of child development itself and would like to treat children like little adults. This is what opens a door to sexualizing children and introducing them to all manner of sexual material at an early age. I've searched for some standard of ethics within queer theory. I've looked for primary values or first principles that it draws on to construct a new and improved ethical system, something that would suggest it is being expressed at the self-authoring stage. I haven't found it. Its ethics are often implied and not stated explicitly in positive or constructive terms. Its primary value, as mentioned, is individual freedom. Everything else rests on that, such as the deconstruction of normativity, critiques of power structures, celebration of diversity, and radical inclusion. It offers no other ethical framework that I have been able to find that constructively supports social cohesion and collaboration. It seems to naively and narcissistically assume that everything will just naturally work out splendidly if no one is expected to contend with the constraints of social responsibility. It's time to introduce another concept. This will help us understand how queering got this far, given how ridiculous I hope it is starting to sound. It's called the pre-trans fallacy and was first coined by the integral theorist Ken Wilber. Initially, Wilber used it to point out that Western analytic psychology tended to attribute transpersonal experiences to an infantile consciousness. In other words, it fallaciously attributed the transpersonal to the pre-personal, because both describe the dissolving of ego boundaries and an experience of oneness with the world. What stands between these two stages is the ego. A person at the transpersonal stage retains the functional capacities of ego, which is included and integrated. It turns out that this fallacy can go the other way, too. Earlier stages can be confused with latter stages because they can appear similar. There are some psychologically regressed states, such as psychosis, that have been seen as equivalent to or on the way to enlightenment. In the case of queering, the pre-social imperial stage can be confused with the trans-social self-authoring stage because they both question the norms of the interpersonal stage. Just as the transpersonal transcends and includes the functioning ego, so too the self-authoring stage transcends and includes the interpersonal. I don't know how often it happens, but it is also entirely possible that the self-authoring stage can be confused with the imperial stage. The perception here is that if you aren't willing to go along with our rules, you must be immoral and antisocial. If queering was at the self-authoring stage, it would recognize a broader range of primary values and principles. It would be able to construct new norms that further pro-social values along with individual freedom. It would not focus so exclusively on individual freedom. I think it's important to recognize two different meanings for the word norms. The meaning that quering uses, and is common for many people, is that it is a strong social expectation for behavior that meets with some form of coercive control if it's violated. The other meaning is that it is simply what most people do. Something can be true in the second sense without necessarily having to be true in the first sense. I think this is one of the avenues of thinking that can happen at the self-authoring stage. Let me explain. If we go back in time to when the word queer was reclaimed by the LGBT movement, there was a rejection of heteronormativity in terms of the first definition of a norm being something that must be followed, or else there would be some form of coercion or punishment. In large measure, in the liberal West, this has been overcome, and that is a good thing. We recognize that while most people are heterosexual, it doesn't have to be a rule to be enforced. We have questioned heterosexuality when it is an oppressive norm and conferred equal rights to homosexuals. I would like to coin a term to describe this process. I call it generative ethics. While queer theory has an implicit set of ethics aimed at individual liberation, it takes a destructive approach. Rather than generating new ethical norms that also incorporate social responsibility, it seeks to dismantle norms. It's not satisfied for there to be equal rights for LGBTQ plus people. It wants to deconstruct heterosexuality and sexual dimorphism altogether as merely oppressive social constructs. The fact is that heterosexuality is still normal in the second sense of the word. It is what is most common. Most people are heterosexual and see sex as the binary of male and female. While this doesn't have to be what everyone believes and lives according to, there is a good evolutionary reason for it. The historical reason for these norms in the first sense of the word was not arbitrary. Reproduction is better facilitated when men and women find each other sexually attractive. That doesn't make homosexuality wrong or immoral. But we don't have to ignore or attack this common tendency in human beings to include homosexuality as also legitimate. The fact that heterosexuality is so prevalently seen and talked about and depicted in advertising, film, and elsewhere doesn't make it an evil, oppressive force that must be deconstructed and seen as no better than any other sexuality. At least for the purpose of reproduction, which is a foundational necessity for the continuation of the human species, it has a certain importance that homosexuality cannot claim. Can we not just be honest about this? How smart is it to demonize heterosexuality when it is a precondition for the future of humanity? Men and women who want to have children and start a family together cannot be seen as the enemy according to a liberation ethics if we care about our species having a future. It doesn't make any sense. It also doesn't make sense that men can get pregnant because a woman can claim to be a man. There are good reasons why this isn't considered normal. In my first video in this Questioning Woke Psychotherapy series, I declared my intention to not only critique the woke, but to attempt to preserve whatever is true and useful in it. When it comes to queer theory and queering, what is true and useful about it is that it questions oppressive social norms. Of the many people that I have read or listened to who offer scathing critiques of queer things, I can't think of one that attempts to recognize and preserve this. At the same time, I don't want to take the weak position of trying to present both sides of the argument. I do mean to assault queering. Its excesses deserve to be stopped in their tracks if possible. I believe, quite literally, that if Left to carry on with its project, it will destroy Western civilization and not replace it with anything better. It will make whatever remains much worse. This may be a brutal metaphor, but I'm going to use it. What I've been saying goes beyond saving a baby in the bathwater. Instead, I'm suggesting that quering needs to be defeated. Then, generative ethics is like removing the gold teeth from the mouth of a fallen enemy. Value needs to be extracted. Those gold teeth could become the self-reflective, critical faculties of the self-authoring stage of development. The dead body left behind is the fixation at the imperial stage. Let me be clear, and this is a crucial point. What needs to be killed and die is not the imperial stage, but our fixation and identification with it beyond childhood. It needs to be preserved and carry on, but made subordinate to a greater embrace. In the head of quering, those gold teeth will take a bite out of anything normal, legitimate, or dominant. It is an adult 2-year-old on a rampage. Removed from their head, those gold teeth can be used for purposes aligned not only with individual liberation, but also social cohesion, collaboration, and harmony. These gold teeth can represent questioning and transcending unjust norms more selectively. They can draw on first principles to construct new norms beyond blind obedience to outdated norms. Interpersonal fundamentalists have taken many gold teeth themselves and fashioned them into golden shackles. Generative ethics can take these shackles, melt them down, and fashion them into fine jewelry. Moral adornments, if you will. A crown of responsibility for our humanity, if I dare say such a corny thing. My apologies for the clunky metaphor, but I hope you get the gist of what I'm saying. That's all I have to say about this for now. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.